With this lecture, I'm going to present you with my own philosophy of technology, which I've called critical theory of technology or critical constructivism. It's a combination of ideas from the tradition of critical theory and social constructivism. This lecture is going to discuss the possibility of a more democratic organization of technological societies. The key term here is rationalization. This idea was introduced by the German sociologist Max Weber. He said that modern societies are characterized by the introduction of calculation and control in all the major institutions. He was thinking of corporations and bureaucracies. This is a key idea in the sociological tradition, which contrasts the traditional organization of societies before modern times with what is called modernity, that is to say, the kind of society in which we live. Characteristic of modern societies is the role of technical disciplines. These are the disciplines that make it possible to introduce calculation and control into social organization. There are different kinds of technical disciplines involved. Engineering, for example, is involved in the development of technologies. Management and the theories of management organize bureaucratic life. Research produces innovations. But in all these cases, the technical disciplines have been fused with capitalism. They've developed under the hegemony of capitalism. And this means that they all are characterized by the assumption that the way to make things work, the way to rationalize them, involves control from above, the unchecked power of managers in organizing economic and social life. Well, modern societies are rich because they're based on a successful technology, but they're also problematic, and we've begun to notice more and more the problematic character of our society. There are, for example, technocratic tendencies in modern societies, a tendency to believe that everything is a technical problem and there's an expert who can solve it for you, when in fact, of course, we know that many normative issues, issues of values, arise in our social life. Then there's the problem of consumerism and the mass media, the degeneration of social life into the acquisition of advertised goods. Environmental crisis has emerged also in recent times as a huge issue that threatens the survival of the society. Surveillance and social control on the internet frighten us now with the dystopian prospect of total control by the social powers over our individual lives. And then finally, there is a problem of sort of what you might think of as a spiritual problem. There's a technical mentality abroad that blocks thinking about normative and social solutions to problems. Well, philosophy of technology has emerged in large part as a form of social critique, a critique of these tendencies in modern society, with the goal of achieving a more democratic form of rationalization. In other words, not a return to pre-modern traditional conditions, but move forward on the continuum of rationalization toward a more democratic form. I'm going to recommend a famous book by Herbert Marcuse which gives you a good sense of how this argument has been made. Here's the One-Dimensional Man is the book that I would recommend that you get if you want to know more about how this critique of modernity has been developed. Okay, well, there's a theoretical obstacle to pursuing the critique, and this obstacle is determinism, technological determinism. It's a popular view. It has three main principles. Technology, it's said, develops on a single track from less to more efficient forms. So science and efficiency determine development on this track. And society must adjust to technological imperatives at each stage. So what's wrong with this deterministic view? First of all, we've seen that development can branch in different directions. There is no single track. Think about the bicycle. And then we've also seen that there are social influences on the choice of designs. Technology does not determine itself, but is part of a social process. And then finally, we've also talked about the reciprocal influence of technology and society. I formulate this reciprocal influence with the idea of double aspects. Technology has double aspects. You can analyze it under each of these two aspects. On the one hand, you can make a seemingly complete statement of the nature of a technology just on purely technical grounds. Look into all the engineering that went into it. But secondly, the technology has a cultural dimension, and that shows up in a study of the way in which the technology fits into social life, the meanings that it has acquired, the associations and political aspects of its place in society. We can reformulate this duality as function and meaning. A technical function rooted in causal mechanisms, and meaning that the society has granted to the technical devices. Technical disciplines contain the knowledge of those causal mechanisms. But in the actual life of the society, the users attribute meanings to the technology, and those meanings emerge from experience, from what is called in philosophy the life world. This is the world of everyday experience. It evolves and changes over time, and as it does, it influences the way in which people signify technology, and that in turn has an influence on the design as that design evolves and develops from one iteration to the next. Another important category for understanding technology and society is the concept of hegemony. Hegemony is a non-coercive power based on the way meanings have been attributed to social objects. If we think, for example, of the government as embodying the values of society as legitimate and necessary, then we will be less likely to challenge it. Its hegemony is based, therefore, not on the simple fact that it can kill you, which it can, but more fundamentally on the meaning that it has acquired in our minds. Hegemony is based on taken for granted assumptions about life, what seems natural, obvious, rational. And hierarchical control from above, is a hegemonic assumption built into modern capitalist societies. If you want to get things done, put someone in charge. That's the idea, and it seems obvious. This influences technological design, as we've seen with the example of de-skilling. So the design then confirms the hierarchy. Once the technical devices have all been organized to de-skill labor, it seems obvious that you need someone who does have skills to run the system. What we call technical codes support hegemonic beliefs. These are the taken for granted meanings and standards that characterize technology in society. Here's an example of a technical code, one from an earlier time, so you can see how codes are historically contingent. This is a cotton mill in the South in the US in the 1920s, at a time when child labor was simply an obvious fact of life. So here you have what looks like a 10-year-old girl working on an automatic spinning machine. And notice where the controls are placed. She has at her disposal controls of the machine, which was designed for people of her size. Obviously, later on, when adults are operating the machinery, things have to be redesigned for them. But this is an example of how a technical code seems to establish the necessity, the obvious necessity of certain social arrangements. If the machines are designed for 10-year-olds, why then it seems obvious that 10-year-olds must belong to the workforce. So we're now dealing with a peculiar feature of technology. It mixes facts and values in a way we're not normally accustomed to thinking about. Acknowledging facts is what we consider rational behavior. And we also think usually that values are something subjective, they're beliefs that we hold. But look at technology. In technology, the facts incorporate values. The values are built in. They're built in through the influence of those social meanings on the technical designs. This gives rise to what I call a technological unconscious. Technologies are explained, and we think about them usually in terms of their function. But this obscures their meaning and their history. It gives us the impression that technologies are purely rational. Well, of course, there is some element of rationality in them, otherwise they wouldn't work, but they're not pure because there's always in the background some social influence on design, some history. I'll give you an example in the next slide. Why are there exit signs in theaters? It seems perfectly reasonable. Anybody with common sense would say, yes, there should be an exit sign so people can find their way out if there's a fire. In fact, exit signs are not in theaters because everyone knew they were essential. They're in theaters because there was a fire in 1903 in the Iroquois Theater in Chicago, and that fire resulted in hundreds of deaths because people could not find the exits. And as a result, all over the country, city councils demanded that theaters put exit signs in the theater. And this historical fact resulted in a rational arrangement. But when we see the exit sign, we don't think that there's some history behind it. We seem satisfied with the explanation that it is a rational thing to have done. So the problem for us, thinking about how to improve our society, is how to break the hegemonic circle, the circle in which the obviousness of technology confirms the necessity of social arrangements. And the answer is social movements. There have been especially since World War II, many social movements that are about changing, abolishing, improving technology. And that has really begun to penetrate the hegemonic circle and open it up for redesign. So here's some examples. The first significant movements were about nuclear weapons. These were movements that called for international control of weapons and disarmament. And these movements were small, but they had a political impact, and eventually significant agreements were reached with the Russians to control nuclear weapons. In the case of medicine, we've seen an example with the AIDS experimentation of how a social movement could affect a supposedly rational system. Ecology is another example. Since the late 1960s, early 70s, this movement has grown and now has had a huge impact on the economy, with regulation protecting air and water quality, and now also the disposal of toxic chemicals, and now also climate change. And then there's a final type of technical politics that I want to mention, and that's hacking. Hackers have modified computer systems in interesting ways that have been picked up by masses of users and become standard features. We saw an example of that with the Minitel. So all these cases show us human values entering into design and breaking through the apparent obviousness of the existing designs. This has democratic implications. We've inherited a technical world built by capitalism. The designs were influenced overwhelmingly by the power of markets and by labor problems. We've discussed how this worked in the origins of capitalism and the emergence of de-skilling. Capitalists were responsible simply for making a profit. That was their job. If they didn't do it well, they disappeared and other people took their place. Workers and the communities in which factories were located were not invited into the design process. So the technological heritage that we live with today emerges from a design process that excludes two important actors, communities and workers. Their exclusion results in some problems which they articulate as values. For example, communities protest the pollution caused by factories in their neighborhood. Sometimes they claim the right to change the way the factories operate in the name of health. Health is a value which they put forward. Workers also have protested through their unions or through legal challenges, or simply by becoming scarce when the labor market was favorable to them, against all kinds of impositions, dangers of labor, the toxic environments, disregard for their concerns, demoralization due to tyrannical behaviors by bosses, and so on. And again, these protests of workers appear as values which they put forward in opposition to the existing systems. So those excluded from the design process enter now through public resistances of one sort or another in the name of values, and they formulate these values in language. So you get a typical contrast between, on the one hand, the facts as embodied in the existing technology and values that are formulated linguistically, that are proposed, for example, as slogans in protest movements. But those values that appear at first as in language aspire to become technical facts through redesign. So facts and values mix in a peculiar way in the case of technology. We can say that values are not just ideology or talk, as sometimes people with conservative views complain, but rather values are the facts of the future. This suggests the possibility of a more democratic technology as a general prospect for modern society. And this is what I call democratic rationalization. And it would incorporate more systematically and with less conflict the concerns of communities and workers with the technology that is employed in industry. Okay, so that's the end of this lecture and also of this part of the course. We'll begin next time with a lecture on our finite nature as human beings in relation to technology.